All right, so we're up in the spare room at Wellspring, leaning into Able Project videos, and we're talking about EAT, discipline, specifically the rhythm of celebration.
Sure, yeah.
Often we don't connect this to our spiritual lives, but maybe we should.
Totally.
And it's actually a key theme in the scriptures.
Sure, yeah. And I think even just looking back through the storyline of the
Yeah.
Bible, Genesis 1, Genesis 2, one way you can look at these early chapters of the Bible is through the lens of celebration.
Which seems a little odd.
Exactly, yeah. So I think bear with me for a little bit here, but
Yeah.
as you read through Genesis 1 in particular, there's the refrain where God says, it is good, it is good, it is good, and then it ends with the day 7 rest.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that often Jewish interpreters look at Sabbath and rest is through the lens of celebration. And so as God is delighting in his creation, it is good, it is good. That's celebratory language in and of itself.
Yeah.
And then culminating with this day of, yes, it's rest, but also it's a day of celebration looking back at what God has done and
That's
delighting in his creation.
That's cool.
So that's
So it's
Genesis
like
1.
You imagine God creates it, he looks at it, he's like, that's good. There's also built into that though, right? Like by day 6, the end of day 6, he says, that's Tov mode. That's really
good.
So
Exactly,
it's almost
yeah.
like, oh man, this is awesome. And then he rests.
Totally, exactly. And so there's all this delight, there's this celebration, that God's good creation, God is
cool.
delighting in what he has made.
And that continues.
It continues in Genesis 2. So kind of zooms in a little bit. Adam and Eve kind of enter the picture, at least more, specifically here in Genesis 2. And as Eve is created, there's this moment where Adam at the end of Genesis 2, he kind of goes into this like poetic sort of mode, this celebratory mode. And there's this, couple verses there where the language is very celebratory, where Adam is delighting in Eve. You're a bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. And there's this kind of language.
It's like a love song.
A love song, exactly.
Yeah.
And so the story starts off with, big picture, creation, there's this celebration happening. And then zooming in on the relationships, the kind of the more narrow focus, if you will, Adam and Eve, there's celebration built into the story from the very beginning.
That's awesome.
There's delight, there's joy. But, Genesis 3, most of us kind of know the story here. Sin enters the world, humans rebel, and start to go their own way. And so as a result, a lot of that kind of celebratoriness, if you will, that delight, that joy, that goodness, is now mixed with pain and suffering and the lack of joy. And so that's one of the effects of sin entering into the world. But as God kind of sets on a mission to redeem and reconcile his good world and humanity.
Through Abraham
and his
and
family.
Moses in Egypt, rescues them.
Totally. So as God is forming Israel, forming his people, one of the many things that God instructs his people to do or to practice or to have the discipline of is to have these regular, a variety of points of the year, these celebrations, these feasts.
Which sometimes, as New Testament followers of Jesus, we kind of are like, oh, they did these feasts. But they feel very distant from our everyday life. Maybe you can just shed some light on like, what would one of those feasts look like?
For sure. So, for like one of the big ones was Passover. And we talked about that a little bit in connection with like communion or the Lord's Supper. But that was also a celebratory feast looking back at the faithfulness of God and what he has done. So that's one of the bigger ones there, Passover. But there's also an instance in Deuteronomy 14 where God instructed his people to basically give a tithe or a tenth of all their sort of possessions, if you will, all their kind of resources to be put in this like, for
celebration fund.
It's celebration fund, exactly. So the point was that part of Israel's, what we might say giving was giving towards that they would have these resources to have a community-wide celebration, to delight in and to recognize the goodness of God amongst themselves.
And so built into everyday life, the discouragement, the ups and downs of life, God actually was like, all right, guys, I want you to actually throw parties and celebrate as a way to remember me and be with each other.
Exactly. And this wasn't just kind of like a random haphazard sort of thing. You read through the Old Testament and the Torah in particular, there was like very specific months or seasons of the year they were supposed to do these things. So it was more or less on a set schedule, if you will. It was a discipline. It was a rhythm for what Israel was supposed to do.
And their lack of actually doing some of those celebratory gatherings actually leads to exile.
Exactly. So a lot of the, it's connected often to worship as well, this aspect of celebration. And so as Israel is kind of in the land, David, Solomon, things begin to fall apart after Solomon in particular, Israel begins to go their own way. And instead of celebrating the goodness of Yahweh, the goodness of the God who rescued them, they in turn, and one way to look at this is they begin celebrating other gods and going and doing other rituals and other practices that are not aligned with God's heart. And so, as the story goes, they do end up in exile. They do end up in a foreign land. And it's in this space where Israel is in this state of mourning and longing and anticipation for God to bring them back into the land, for God to reunite the tribes. And the prophets.
There's even prophets, like Isaiah, is talking about imagining future celebrations when the tribes all come back together and they throw a feast.
Exactly. So much of the hope that the prophets give is, yes, they announce that God is, judging Israel and disciplining Israel, but there's also this forward-looking hope, and the language that's often associated with this hope is in the language of celebration and feasts. You mentioned Isaiah 26 talks about
good wine,
the best meat,
fatty meat.
Exactly, and all the tribes are back together. Even people from outside of Israel are joining into this epic celebration feast when God redeems and restores. And so it's into this sort of kind of worldview or this way of thinking that God's people are formed from their past and in their present and looking forward in anticipation through the context of celebration. So oftentimes when you think of even like the Psalms are a good example, there will be this language of, you turn my mourning into dancing. So this recognition that life is difficult, life is hard, perhaps that psalmist is in exile or like in a personal exile or thinking about Israel's exile, but recognizing that what God is kind of leaning into and what is how he's guiding his people is towards from mourning to dancing.
Cool. And so think of Psalm 136, give thanks to the Lord for he is good.
Totally.
But like in the midst of the ups and downs of life, there's this challenge, this invitation, this exhortation to celebrate God.
For sure. And so even like the trajectory of the Psalms, by the time you get to the end of the Psalms in particular, you're mentioning that, so much of the refrain or the lines of the Psalms are praise Yahweh or give thanks to Yahweh. And it's recognition that part of Israel's prayer life and worship life was an intentional redirection back to the celebration of the goodness of God. Now, when we get into the New Testament, we see Jesus really just picking up this same storyline. He announces in Luke 4, one of his first public sort of appearances, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to proclaim good news to the poor. It's echoing back into Isaiah and back into the Torah. This moment of celebration is finally here. Jesus does his ministry. He's eating and drinking with all the wrong kinds of people that
gets in trouble for
gets in trouble with it. He's accused of being a glutton and a drunkard, and he's having all of these, kind of like mini banquets, if you will, with sinners and tax collectors and prostitutes and dining with these people.
He's like prefiguring what Isaiah was talking about
for sure
when the Messiah would come.
Exactly.
I love his teaching in Luke 15 where he's like basically people are complaining about who he's eating with, who he's celebrating with, and he tells 3 stories, right? One is about a lost sheep, one is about a lost coin, and one is about a lost son. And at the end of each of those stories in Luke 15, there's a party that's thrown, a celebration. And it's this picture, Jesus gives these stories as a picture of what is the gospel about? What is life about? What is the kingdom about? And it's sort of the hinge at the end, right, is we celebrate together.
Yeah, for sure. And thinking about how that was continued on into the early chapters of the book of Acts, and into Paul's ministry, how that they're eating together, that they're breaking bread together, Acts chapter 2. Paul, as he's forming these communities, James and John and the whole kind of group there, one of the key things that they would do is that a lot of the Sunday gathering was around what, it kind of sounds strange to us, but oftentimes scholars look back and they call it the love feast, right? Where they're celebrating, they're having this, I wouldn't call it that today, but this meal that they would have together as part of their regular gathering in anticipation of what was to come, and also looking back at what Jesus had done for them.
Yeah, Paul, I was thinking of First Thessalonians, he talks about, sorry, I got to sneeze up in the spare room. The dust.
There you go.
But he talks about in 1 Thessalonians, right, rejoice always. And Paul knows suffering.
Totally.
So there's this push towards rejoicing. Even in the midst of tough times, you need challenges, right? The church that he's overseeing, the churches that he's overseeing, these home churches, these spaces where people might be tempted to just gloomily eat their food to rejoice together.
For sure. And you read through the New Testament, through the whole Scripture, none of the authors are minimizing pain and suffering in this world, but they're also calling God's people, Paul in particular that you're mentioning, to kind of have this orientation, recognizing that the gospel is fundamentally good news. And that
Evangelion is good news.
Good news. And we need to,
it's not just news.
Exactly. And we as God's people need to recognize that and live into that truth, that what we believe and what we live into is the good news of Jesus.
So how does that translate then into sort of our modern moment?
Yeah, for sure. I think one thing that, like a line from a pastor in New York, John Tyson, he has this line where he says, we need to be a people of celebration in an age of cynicism. And so he's recognizing that latter part of that line, that in our cultural moment right now, it's very easy to be cynical. Very easy to be bitter and kind of worn down by what's on the news or what's happening in this or that scenario. But God's people, going back to this concept of good news, are to be a people fundamentally about the good news, celebration. And so what does that potentially look like? Yeah. Well, I mean, for us and kind of our, kind of context, we try to do this like with our small group or WELL community. Like each week we have food, and that kind of bleeds into some of the other aspects as far as community goes. Yeah. But it's not just like this kind of side-on sort of thing, like, oh, just throw random stuff together and, whatever kind of thing. It's actually a fundamental, like, we are intentional about having good food and having intentionality in that, because we want to have a space each week where we're celebrating together, we're with each other, recognizing the gift that God has given us in these relationships, and also recognizing the goodness and the grace of God in our own sort of lives. And so I think that's one way to kind of incorporate this. Food often kind of bleeds into this a little bit.
Yeah, it's a way
community
to be together and celebrate.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also think of worship.
Yeah.
Worship as a space where we sing songs together, like on Sunday morning, where we come and we celebrate what God has done.
For sure.
That's sort of built in. So you have the food, the gathering, but you also have sort of the corporate worship space.
Yes.
I also just think of the personal choices involved in this.
Yeah.
Right? To rejoice always or give thanks, for the Lord is good, both communally and individually. Yeah. And I just wonder how much we disconnect that from faithfulness.
Yeah. Right? As far as the personal intentional choice there.
Yeah, and 100%. Communally.
Yes, yeah.
Right? Like how easy is it for a group of people to talk about all the things going wrong in the world, whether it's over food or not.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, COVID or whatever, versus, all right, what do we have to celebrate today?
For sure. I think being intentional with that, and that's leaning into, I think, the directive of Scripture itself, of the Psalms, give thanks, or Paul's echo of rejoice in the Lord always, I think is super crucial and really important. Because what we're doing, we've mentioned this a little bit, is anticipating that great celebration that's to come in the new heavens and new earth.
That's good. So we want to make space for pain, but also choose joy.
Totally. 100%.
And that's sort of working at that tension there.
For sure.
That's awesome. Cool. Thanks, man.